All right, so we are recording now. This is our first webinar on that stuff in the Bible, which is our first attempt to kind of, as we walk through the Bible together this current year, to try and pick out, engage some of the very particular topics, very particular issues that emerge as you read the Bible. If you're even thinking as you're reading the Bible, you're like, boy, some things just either are challenging or unconfusing, or some of them are just, really they mess with you a little bit. Well, since we started with Genesis chapter 1, we thought we'd begin with maybe one of the conversations that's been a part of Christendom, particularly for the last 150 years, and very particular, but even in the last bit, related to the age of the earth and the different narratives related to creation. So tonight, as our first webinar panel, I am Matt Miller. I'm your host, and glad to have all of you attendees that have jumped on. Super glad that you're a part of this. You'll have an opportunity to be able to throw in some questions. So you should be able to, if I have set this up correctly, you should be able to submit some questions. So you might want to, if you want to go ahead and do a quick test on that, in case I haven't set that up correctly. That would probably be very helpful. All right. What I want to do first is I'm going to just a quick word of prayer, and then I'm going to give a chance for each one of our panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and then from there we will jump into the conversation. So let me pray. Father, thank you. Thank you that you have spoken, and in your speaking, you have invited us to know you. And in our conversation tonight, Lord, we want to see you more. We want to know you more. We want to also have an opportunity to love each other well. As we think about you, as we think about what you've shown us, both in your world and in the world, and that we would be men and women who love you with all our hearts, all our souls, all our minds, and all our strength. So, Lord, guide our conversation. I pray that this would be just a really, really wonderful evening. I pray this in Christ. Amen. All right. Well, let me give you guys a chance to give you a 30-second intro as to who you are, kind of stage of life, what you're about, and anything you find pertinent, exciting to tell. So, Clark, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. So I'm Clark Collins. I'm married to Martha. Actually, Friday is our 44th wedding anniversary.
All right. Well done.
So we have 4 children and 7 grandchildren. I am currently saying that I'm retired, but it doesn't mean that I'm not just super busy. Some of what is the opportunity to serve on the elder board and also do some of the facility work for the church.
That's awesome. I love how what you're saying, though. You're just speaking it into being. See, this is a creation conversation already. So, all right, Ivy, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Ivy Tyson. I am 30. I'm single. I live with Tiffany Willie, who's a dear friend of mine, best roommate ever. I moved to Georgia about not quite 5 years ago now, because I work with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. And so I moved out here for work all on my own and found RCC and really found a church family in a real way here at RCC. So I'm involved in lots of odds and ends of things. And my background is in history and anthropology and education. So kind of the social sciencey stuff. So that's why I got interested in this topic to start with.
Cool. That's awesome. All right, Kevin, give us 30 seconds.
I'm Kevin Turner. I'm married to Carissa Turner, which I'll probably sing sometimes. We've been married for 12 and some change. I have a 5-year-old daughter and 15-month-old boys now. So if y'all hear that, I'm right below them. So,
well, two 15-month-olds make one 3-year-old, right? Isn't that how it works? So
right, but with 4 feet. So it's a little more noise. I'm the senior city planner at the city of Roswell. I've been there this time around, I guess, 3 years in a couple of weeks. So
awesome. That's terrific. We're super excited about this. We're going to kind of, just to clarify, this is probably going to be a more unique webinar in that in this particular case, we actually have different positions that people are holding as it relates to creation. So that's one of the things that's going to be different from some of the future conversations we have. But just to be clear, this is a conversation, not a debate. No one here is claiming to be an expert in their particular area or field. They are, but everyone does hold to their position with a degree of conviction and desire to hold those things. So to begin the conversation, and I did have someone ask, is this where we post questions? And the answer is yes, on the place where it says white Q&A. So go ahead and post questions if you have them, and we'll get to those, kind of work them in as we go along as they fit. If we don't get to your questions along the way, then we'll be more than glad to address them on the RCC Connect Facebook page. So To that end, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give each one of the three of our panelists an opportunity, about 3 minutes or so, to walk us through the basics, if you will, the basis of their position, the three positions being, three views, if you will, being young Earth creationism, old Earth creationism, and evolutionary creationism. So those are the three views that are represented. Clark's going to be holds to a young Earth creationism, Ivy to the old Earth creationism, Kevin to the evolutionary creationism. So, Clark, we're going to give you 3 minutes, and you're going to kind of give us the pieces and the elements, and then we'll move to Ivy and then to Kevin. Then we'll kind of allow that to be something that moves through the conversation from there. So, Clark, take it away. You got 3 minutes. Tell us a little bit about.
Okay, so the young Earth view, it's also called the calendar day view. It accepts the first chapter of Genesis as historical and chronological in character. It views the creation week as consisting of 6 24-hour days followed by a 24-hour Sabbath. These 7 24-hour days and the time frames indicated in the Bible's genealogies indicate that the world is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. And this has been the most commonly held understanding of the Genesis account, both in Jewish and Christian history. So the view is based on a number of key facts. I'll take time and kind of present 3 of them. So first, the Hebrew word for day is yom, spelled Y-O-M in English. It's defined by God in Genesis 1:5 in 2 ways. First as the light, and also as one evening and morning period. Although the word can be translated as time based on context, everywhere that the Bible and also literature of that period uses the word yom as modified by a number, such as day 1, day 2, it always means a normal solar day. So the Genesis writers seem to go out against any interpretation of non-literal days by terminating each day's work by the formula, and the evening and the morning were the first day or the second day, and therefore. So secondly, God provides his own commentary on the days of creation in Exodus chapter 20, verses 9 and 11. It says, as part of the Decalogue, the scripture says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. So these verses seem to make no sense if the creation days were anything other than 24-hour periods. And then finally, Romans 5 says that death entered the world through sin, which occurred with the fall of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. So the fossil record had to be laid down after the fall and not before some of the other views hold. So there are a couple of there's several objections. One of the objections to the young Earth view is that the sun was not created until the 4th day. But this issue can be resolved in a number of ways. One assumption is that God provided the light just as he will, as indicated in Revelation, in the new heaven and the new earth. So then a second objection is that this view seems to disregard current scientific research about the age of the earth. However, young earth advocates hold that the fall and the worldwide flood during Noah's day were catastrophic enough to change the geological processes from what they were then to what they are today.
Okay. Cool. All right. Clark, thank you for the big picture on that. Obviously, there is way, way more. And one of the things, just to clarify for everyone, because any of these views, they're not single points, right? They're usually continuums within each one of these views. So to understand that, understanding within a young earth or an old earth or evolutionary creationism, there are people who land along a continuum even within those views. So we've used this concept a couple times in other areas of theological positions, is that there's always a continuum. No one's fixed in one point. There's a continuum, and everyone's landing somewhere for a particular reason. So Clark, thank you for articulating that. A lot of great insight, a lot of good points on some of even the natural elements that have been criticized or that get pushed back against. So all right, thanks, Clark. Ivy, why don't you jump in? Take 3 minutes to give us a picture of old Earth.
Great. Yeah. So speaking of spectrums, the old Earth position is probably the widest spectrum out of these 3 positions, because even within old Earth, there's several camps. So I'm just going to give you kind of a broad overview and tell you which one I land on without getting too far into it. So basically, the old Earth position is what it sounds like. It's going to agree with the general scientific data from things like physics and things like geology that are going to suggest that the universe is about, 13.7 billion-ish years old. Why the 0.7 matters at that point, I don't know. The Earth is also very old, so we're looking at, 4.5 billion-ish years old. Old Earth positions are going to differ on when they think human beings came into the picture. So there's going to be old Earth people that are fairly comfortable with keeping to the literal genealogies in Genesis. There are going to be some people that want to push it further back. There's quite a lot of range in there. You may also sometimes hear old Earth creationism called progressive creationism. So that's another term that's getting popular to kind of help explain some of that. So the other kind of main distinction for old Earth creationism as a platform, as a set of positions, like a little cluster, is going to be that old Earth creationists don't accept the idea that God used the process of evolution. So the idea of mutation causing speciation that actually resulted in new kinds of creatures. They would reject evolution as the mechanic for God creating. So that's a distinction from what Kevin's going to talk about. Within the old Earth spectrum, I'm going to kind of simplify here, but I think this is helpful to think about it this way. There's sort of like three main camps. And most of these have to do with how you're going to interpret Genesis 1. So kind of back to the same question that Clark has. So one of those is the day-age theory. So this is the idea that the days in Genesis are using the definition of yom, which is more like in the days of King David, which is not a 24-hour day. And so that would mean that one creation day could be a massive expanse of time in which God was doing things. And so the idea of the Genesis account was less about saying the point is this is a literal day, and more about the point of grouping the order in which God created without it really being about the time. Another option in the old Earth position is this idea of days separated by time. And so the way that the Hebrew kind of works out in Genesis, it's poetry. The Hebrew's pretty complicated anyway. There's nothing that requires you to read the days as being consecutive. And so it's actually possible that there could have been 6 24-hour days with a billion years in between. Not saying it has to be that way, but the text doesn't dismiss it. So you can read Genesis 1 coherently and still basically hold to that idea. There's also quite a lot of conversations about whether Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, whether there's any time lapse between that and the next verses. Totally unclear from the text. You could theoretically put as many billion years as you wanted in there, and it wouldn't actually change the meaning of the text at all.
And the third one?
Yeah, so the third one is the framework idea. So this is the idea that the days aren't days at all. They're just ways of thinking about the stuff that God created, and God ordered them in the narrative poetically to give you a sense of what he did without it actually being about days at all.
Cool. All right. That's quite the wide view. So
yeah, and I would say I think I'm more likely to hold to the days separated by age. I could be edging over into day age a little bit, but those are the ones I find most persuasive out of those, if that helps.
Cool. Thanks, Abby. All right, Kevin, walk us through evolutionary creationism.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with just a little bit of a definition because it may be less familiar to people. This is taken from the BioLogos website. They're probably the best resource for people who are interested in this. There's a longer one, but I'll be a little short and just say their statement is they take the Bible seriously as the inspired and authoritative word of God, and it takes science seriously as a way of understanding the world God has made. So for me, it's more about the interpretation of Genesis that allows for agreeing with the understanding of science. So Ivy pointed out the literary framework. That's going to be the predominant view for EC, evolutionary creation. I'll just point out a few other things in the language. It kind of lends itself to a literary reading. You have things like beasts of the field, which is only ever used poetically for animals later in the Old Testament. You have all the repetition. You have things like God saying, and it was good 7 times. The other point for interpretation is understanding the world of the ancient Near East. So, because I think that matters almost more than some of these other things, because we want to know what it was written for. In the world of the ancient Israelites, there were other creation stories that were similar to ours. There's watery chaos. There is creations of human from dirt and dust. There's even a garden sometimes. There's a fall. There's almost always a flood. However, in these stories, humans and the world were created from violence and death. And humans were often servants of gods. So when God revealed himself to Moses, he could have explained evolutionary science that would come some 3,000 years later, but that probably wouldn't have been very helpful. Instead, what he does is explains that he created the world by his word and in an ordered fashion. And we are here not as slaves and his servants, but we are created in his image to be his co-regents and stewards of the earth. Quick couple things about the science. I think the most compelling part of that for me was the Human Genome Project, which sequenced our DNA, and it was actually headed by an evangelical Christian, which I have a great book from him that we'll have maybe in the resources later. And when we actually could read our DNA, there were things in there that were predicted from evolutionary theory that showed now that we had the technology to prove the science. But really for me, it's you take the literary framework view and try to consider what the original purpose of Genesis would be. And there's really no reason to reject age of the earth or evolutionary science, because I don't think that's what Genesis is talking about. It's telling us who God is and our relationship to him. So, and that's why I hold to a evolutionary creationist, which is a really clunky word view.
It is. It doesn't flow off like young Earth,
No, yeah.
It doesn't. That's awesome. And I just want to say, like, one of the things, we've gotten to have some really cool conversations in preparation for this. Oh, sorry about that. In preparation for this, and one of the cool things is none of us. I'm not a scientist for sure, but like none of you are claiming to be like you're not geologists or hard scientists, but you're thoughtful people who are reading and have read a ton. And I think one of the things that every single one of the folks here on this panel, every one of you has been on my preaching team for several years now, and you're thoughtful. You read, you work it through. So you've been working out this element of theology for a season, for quite a while now, and have landed on three three different positions, three different views, and yet at the same time are able to kind of function and move forward even in your views and your understanding of God and of the scriptures in a way that's fully coherent, and that allows us to talk through any sermon, any passage in the Bible together and actually build upon others. That's one of the cool things about each one of you guys. But so I think one of the things that leads us, so those some of the views. And again, there's a ton more there. Obviously, that's like, there's a precipice at the edge of each one of these little 3 minutes that could take you into a whole bunch of stuff. We'll have some of those resources available if you're interested in following Alice down any of those holes. But there's a lot of great, insightful, perfect, cool stuff, and we'll point out a couple of those things in the notes. But so I think the question that comes then is why does this matter, right? I mean, there's the conversation, but then why does this in particular matter? And I think it's impossible to get around the reality that the science and creation have just never been super good pals for the long time now. And so I think I'm trying to get a sense of how do those things work together. In particular, what's some of the view understanding of science? That conversation we had the other day in the office is really, really helpful for me. So Ivy, do you want to kind of kick off a little bit, talking through a little bit some of the science, like what is science in particular, and what are the implications for each of you guys as you think theologically about the authority of science, and in particular, then what does this mean theologically in light of your position about how does it shatter people's faith, stuff like that. So Ivy, why don't you jump into some of the science stuff you were kicking around the other day as for how we view it as a culture.
Yeah, sure. So I work for a Christian apologetics organization. So we spend a lot of time talking to people about objections to Christianity, both inside and outside the church. And so science has just become one of those things you have to talk about every time. And I spend a bit of my time on college campuses, just talking to college students of all different worldviews. And so science comes up a lot because we're being taught to believe increasingly that the only real objection is a scientific one. And we're kind of fallen into this scientism attitude that says the only things that are real are things that can be proved by science. Now, obviously that's not true, because you can't even use science to prove that sentence. So what I'm really saying is every idea has to be proved by science except this one, which is how I know I'm right. But generally speaking, that means that as Christians, we have to be really aware of how science works into our conversations and how much power we give it. And so I think there's a lot of value in figuring out what science can and can't do. So science can answer how questions and what questions. It can't necessarily answer.
Give us an example. What do you mean by that?
For instance, if I put the kettle on the stove and it starts boiling and somebody walks in and says, why is the kettle boiling? Someone who knows more about science than I do could explain to you how the heat transfers into the water and turns it into steam and why it makes that sound when it goes through the kettle. Okay, all of that's a scientific explanation for the why of why the water is boiling. But if I walk into the kitchen and say, well, why is the kettle boiling? And Tiffany says, because I wanted a cup of tea, that's also a correct answer that science cannot provide for you.
Gotcha.
So science can't give you information on motive or agency. And the important thing to realize is that those two whys do not exclude each other. In fact, you need both for a coherent understanding of the situation. So science is a great tool that can use observation, repeatable data, even some inductive reasoning to get us to some what's, how's, and functional whys. But there are very important questions about our life that science cannot and should not answer.
Okay. So in that sense, how does that matter when it comes to looking at three different views that all of your view? I mean, though you hold three different views, the thing that holds them all together is God created, right? You're all holding saying God created. There's no doubt about that. So the question is how he created. Now we have some different perspectives on maybe how that played itself out based on certain different elements, whether it's hermeneutic of a particular of the passages of Genesis, or how do you read the passage, or and as well as some of the scientific dynamics. So what are the implications of the science meets creation thing for each one of you guys as you think about the conversations you've had, the things you've read to wrestle with, and your own position?
Well, I think for me is that we can't ignore the science. I mean, the world wants to tell us that there is an opposition between the Bible and between science. So we need to be knowledgeable and have an understanding and the answers the best we can. I think we also have to realize that we all come to the text with an assumption. And are we going to assume that science is right and we're going to try to interpret the Bible in terms of science, or are we going to come the other way and let the Bible interpret the science? And I think as people of faith and people of the Word, we have to always come and say, well, the Bible is true, and I need to interpret science in that way, and know that even though maybe we don't know all the answers, that in the end, it will confirm science. So.
Right. Not that we're trying to claim that the Bible is primarily a scientific book, right? It's not,
correct.
It's not the way God designed it. It's not how he gave it. It's not even its purpose. But that there would not be contradictions ultimately. Yeah. Talk a little bit, Kevin. We talked a little bit about supernaturalism versus naturalism and some of that in our conversation. You want to talk a little bit about that, especially as you think about high science when it comes to evolutionary dynamics versus some just supernaturalism, miracles, etc. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think. I think too often people think they kind of conflate. Let me get this straight. So as you mentioned, there's a spectrum, and the three of us are on a spectrum, but there's even more outside of us.
Right.
So, kind of going further in my direction, there's theistic evolution that says, yeah, there's some sort of God. And that's actually a position of Jewish and Muslims and other people of religious faiths, not the God of the Bible, but God. And then the agnostic, and then an atheist, and then the smallest chunk of people who say, if you're way over here, you must reject all supernatural. And then kind of another small view over on Clark's side on the young earth creation is you must reject all science. Mm-hmm. And these are out here, and they're very small contingents. But that's kind of the way people view creation and evolution. And that's just obviously not my view, and I don't think anyone's view here. I don't think we need to reject science. We don't reject the supernatural, obviously. So when it's very clear, the resurrection, we have it in all gospels. Luke intros his gospel with, I'm telling you things that happened.
Yeah.
It's attested to in Acts, and Peter and Paul even says, without the resurrection, it's pointless. Now, science tells you do not come back from the dead.
Right.
So to Clark's point, obviously, we have the Bible override that. Mm-hmm. because without it, like Paul says, it's pointless. Eat, drink, be merry, right? Because with no resurrection, we have no hope. Yeah. So we reject science there. But when it's less clear and the interpretations of it go back thousands of years, predating science, how to interpret Genesis goes, I mean, you can find writings from Irenaeus, Athanasius, Augustine, Luther, I mean, all these people have talked about it, and that all predated science. And because it's just kind of a strange book, and people have different ways of doing things. So you don't have to reject, or I guess kind of the way I came to it was, if there's multiple ways to interpret it, and then science, which God has revealed to us, may take away one of those views, then maybe that just narrows our understanding. But it's not, I don't think it's letting science interpret the Bible in this instance, because you have to try to understand where the Bible is coming from and what it might have meant originally.
Right. That's well said, Kevin. One of the, Ivy, do you want to add anything to that before we jump? Because I think it'd be really interesting to kind of hear from you guys a little bit of how you got where you got and how you journeyed, because you all journeyed to get where you are.
Yeah, I guess I would just make the point that I find both of those really helpful. So thank you. And I think for me, one of the things to keep in mind is that like these aren't no cost propositions, right? And so no matter what position you take here, it's going to lead to some theological questions. But the point is that we all have theological questions. Like there's no one position that like solves all of them. And so for me, that keeps me pretty humble in this. But I will say that my theological questions have changed as I move through positions. And so it's a continual conversation for all of us, and reading the scientific data and going, what about that? And what about this? And, just there's always a lot going on, especially because science discovers new stuff all the time. By requirement, you kind of have to new questions all the time.
Right. I think you used a quote the other day. I think I have this right somewhere in my notes here. You said, Science isn't reality. Science describes what we see. So it decides what we can call reality. So I think that's to me, that's a really helpful as we start thinking, and this is true, wherever you're in your spiritual journey, or even your faith, or even, your education, like, if you're a high schooler, or, if you're in your 80s, like, hey, like reality is, science doesn't actually make reality. All it does is tell us, hey, this is what we understand about reality in light of what we can see. And I think that's a fundamentally different way of looking at the world than some of what we're being told that we should be looking at the world as. So again, that's just from a Christian worldview, that's some of the ways in which we say, yeah, we hold science very clearly. We want to see what science says about what the world is like, but it doesn't make reality. That we believe actually God creates reality, right? So for all of us. So actually, one of the most important things I think, and this is where, again, we're talking about views and stuff, but some of the most important ways in which we mature as people of faith is by journeying from places and to places. And this is a particular area of view that's taken some movement or some journey for you guys, or some reconfirmation. So I'd love to give each of you guys just a couple minutes. Tell us the story of how you got to where you're at, from what to what, or back to what. So if you're cool, I'm actually going to go backwards this time. I didn't cue you guys on this, but let's go backwards. So Kevin, so we'll start with you. You take us on your journey, and then we'll go back up to Clark.
Okay, yeah. So I grew up with a young earth creationist, and I actually grew up with the narrow view that I pointed to earlier. Essentially that if you did not believe, there was no room for discussion. If you did not believe in the young earth, then you weren't a Christian. And that really was not up for discussion. Our youth group watched those animated videos that came out in the 90s. If anyone remembers those, that shows the rainwater coming down and flooding, and that's how it distorted the record and everything. And honestly, I didn't really think about it again for, I don't know, a decade. I didn't really care. But then when I tried to become a little more serious about my faith and my understanding of the Bible as an adult, later in life, I started reading some church history, and I bought a systematic theology. And what good systematic theologies do is they explain a view, their own, and then other views, and why those views are wrong. And just the concept that an evangelical Christian could have different views, even if it was to put them down,
right.
Kind of honestly, it surprised me. So I started, reading more.
It was like permission. It was like permission for you.
Yeah. Because, again, and this is a broader part of my story, but I was once called sacrilegious for asking a question. because I genuinely did not understand. So that's my background, and that's unfortunate. And I hope there's no one. What Matt's putting on here for everyone is showing us that we're here to ask questions. And so as I kind of studied on my own, I read church history. I read about the early church, the Greek fathers, all of them allegorized in part or in whole Genesis, and which is shocking because maybe they're not Christian. Augustine gave us the idea of original sin, but allegorized Adam and Eve. So there's obviously some tension. Like Ivy said, there's no perfect answers. If not, I think we wouldn't have it, but certainly someone would have it. And then as I try to study the Bible more, I picked up commentaries. And if anybody in my community group is watching, they know I always try to push commentaries on them because I love them. And because I need to read. I don't know a lot of things. And it explaining the world, the ancient world of the Israelites, and just some of the Hebrew poetry and words and way of doing things, it just convinced me to move away from the young earth. I kind of moved to the day age that I explained earlier. I guess what kind of moved me away from that was some of the criticisms of Yom and kind of getting into the Hebrew, and to Clark's point that it can mean time, but it usually doesn't. And so really I kind of moved on to think that we're just not talking about science at all. And so science isn't what I have really no interest in evolution, which maybe I shouldn't say since I'm representing that position. When it comes to science, I think physics is interesting, but biology just isn't. But my understanding of how to read Genesis changed that would allow for that. And actually, real quick, I'll throw a J.I. Packer quote since I'm probably over my time. And he says, "I believe in the inerrancy of Scripture and maintain that in print," as in he's defended in this book. "But exegetically, I cannot see that anything in Scripture says that in the first chapters of Genesis or elsewhere bears on the biological theory of evolution one way or another." And to your point, I guess, about permission, is that if that isn't the point of the first chapter of Genesis, then it's okay to accept that over here while understanding the point is God created the world, and kind of on from there. So that was a brief meandering.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, Kevin. I think one of the fundamental things that I've always appreciated about you, and I think that is a mark of someone who's not afraid of God and not afraid of the scriptures, that you just ask questions of, like, God's not, we don't have to do PR for God. Like, he's good, like he's got it. And if we don't know or can't understand exactly what's going on, like, either that will be revealed, or like we don't know yet, and we may never know, so but to be able to step into it and lean into it, and actually to have it to remain firm in your faith in the midst of it's pretty pivotal. So Ivy, what about you? Walk us through a little bit of your journey and kind of some of the key elements that led you there, but also some of the things that you maybe still holding, like going like, I don't know, I could be moved in a different direction potentially based on some other things.
Yeah, it's funny, when we were talking about this the other day, Kevin and I both realized that we kind of started in the same place and sort of like come to some similar conclusions, just like on different streets. So it's just sort of fun hearing that, because for me, same thing. I grew up in a young earth kind of bubble, and I didn't actually know there were other options. So there was young earth creationism, or there was secular evolution. And I grew up around really thoughtful people who really encouraged discussion and question asking, but this just never came up. And I never knew that there were any other choices. So I was kind of led to believe that either you're a young earth creationist, or you're selling out to the world and the stuff they're going to try to teach you at college. More implicit than explicit, but it was there. Mm-hmm. And so then I went to college at a state university, and I ended up taking an anthropology degree on top of my history degree. And so anthropology is a degree in evolutionary theory. That's basically all it is. And its implications in different places. And so when I was going into some of those early classes, I was sort of praying about it. And I was like, all right, Lord, I don't think this is going to change anything about you. I don't think that this is going to change anything about my faith. So I'm open, because I'd like to know what's real. Whatever is real, I'd like to actually know. So I kind of went into my college experience saying, okay, if evolution turns out to be real, I'd like to know that. And actually what happened then through the course of my anthropology degree was that I became increasingly persuaded by the age of the earth and the age of the universe data, and I didn't see any reason to reject it. I wasn't reading any commentaries. I didn't talk to any other Christians in my life about it. I should have at the time, but I was just kind of processing through it. But I came to Genesis and I was like, all right, that changes nothing about how I read Genesis. All right, fine. But I became increasingly less convinced by the data for evolution and for speciation. I read a lot of Darwin, and for me, really what it came down to was, in my anthropology degree, I think that the human development thing is the Achilles heel of evolutionary theory. And really, I came to the conclusion of, okay, evolutionary theory as it's taught at a secular university is a tenet of naturalism. So it's actually a weapon that naturalism uses to kill other worldviews. As a Christian, I cannot agree to that process. Naturalism needs to go. On balance, I think you could take evolution without all of that mess attached and still be a faithful Christian. I don't find the data for speciation particularly compelling. I'm not taking it. So by the end of college, I had run into what's called oral earth creationism without knowing that existed, and I didn't know any other person who believed it. And I was just kind of agnostic about it for years, and because it didn't make any difference to my life. Like, it didn't actually matter that I'd made that change. I don't think I even talked to my friends about it. It just didn't matter to me that I'd made that change. It wasn't until years later that I started working at RZIM that I then started running across people like Hugh Ross and Fuz Al-Rana, who work at Reasons to Believe. And I picked up Fuzz's book, Who Was Adam, at a conference and read the whole thing on the plane on the way home. And it was the first time I'd ever met a Christian who agreed with me, who had read the same anthropology reports and human development reports that I had and come to the same conclusion. And it just like opened up my eyes that there was a whole community of Christians who were thinking about this stuff and talking about it. So I've been learning a lot ever since.
Yeah, that's cool. One of the things, one of the things I'm hearing from both of you, Kevin and Ivy and Clark, we've talked about this before, is it matters. And it matters to think about it effectively, and it does have implications, and to think it out matters, especially if you're going to be having thoughtful conversations. But it doesn't actually alter fundamentally the fundamentals of faith. And so it's like, you get, which again, we'll talk about that in a minute. But like, where does it land on the? Is this worth taking a sword out and kind of striking your brother kind of thing? It's it's just not, it doesn't land there. So I think that's the cool thing I'm hearing in both of you guys in that. Clark, tell us a little bit about your journey and process.
Yeah, it's really good to hear Ivy and Kevin's story. I'm really similar in that I've held some of all three of these views in different periods of time. I've got to say that I have not been as thoughtful and done as much work, I think, as the two of you all have until recently. So I've really done a lot of reading recently. So too, I started off believing a 24-hour day, young earth view. Growing up in a church, that was a commonly held view. It was the simplest reading of the text. But as I grew older, became more aware of some of the claims of science about the age of the earth. I don't remember when this really was. I spent a couple of years in a Christian school, in a Christian college. And I think there was introduced to the concept of theistic evolution, which I guess, Kevin, is the same thing you're calling evolutionary creation. And that really seemed like a good way to explain the age of the earth. So I know I held that for a while, but then I came across at the time it was called the gap theory. I think Ivy, it was one of the views that you mentioned, that there could be an inordinate amount of time between Genesis 1, verse 1 and verse 2. And also with some of the interpretation of Genesis saying that the earth was formless and void. My interpretation of those words at the time made me think, well, why would God create an earth, that wasn't, perfectly formed? And so that became kind of my way of thinking, well, maybe that's when the fall of Satan occurred and there was some destruction. So I held that. That still allowed me to hold a 24-hour day, but it explained the age of the earth. And I guess really coming into this, I guess that's really the view that I held, but just doing some of this research and coming across that some of those verses, particularly that verse in Exodus 20, verse 9, about the days of creation being similar to the 6 days that man is to labor, said, well, now that, that gap theory doesn't really hold if you interpret that that way. So For me, I think one of the things that causes me to be curious is a lot of people that I respect, um, including Ivy here, hold the day age view. And so it's really something, that I think I'd like to look into some more, because obviously must be some good reasons behind all that.
Cool. Well, I think one of the things that, and one of the desires even behind asking that question, and hopefully for whether you're a panelist, you're an attendee tonight, or if you're watching this later, is to recognize that, like, again, this matters, but the humility through which we should be looking at areas of scripture, particularly like this, that have, when you think about how little scripture we have about the how of creation. And I mean, we have more about like the inside of how the tabernacle is made almost than we do about how, so like we have very little. So to that end, like there's a humility, I think, in that we're invited into with this, not a blindness, or but certainly not an arrogance. And I think that's one of the things I've loved about, our discussion through this has been, not just tonight, but even before this, is that like we can both not only love each other and be like, high-fiving on the same page with Jesus and the resurrection, and at the same time be like, yeah, I'm holding this, and I want to be humble about it. And there may be some things that could shift my mind if I understood them differently, or if I saw them differently, or if there's something was revealed or discovered. I'm going to harken back to something that I feel like Steve Heimlein just said, harken back. Something that Sean said in our panel, what we did at church on Sunday morning a couple of weeks ago, was when he said, keep digging. In that idea that as believers, we shouldn't be afraid of science. I think that's something that's really, I think it's tragic to me when there's a sense of like, oh no, don't let the scientists find stuff that's going to prove that, that God's not who he says he is. Like, that's not a thing to be afraid of. Like, it really, really isn't. So that's what my hope is. We can actually be the kind of people who look and think and wrestle and anticipate and trust God with this. I think one of the, as we're going to need to close here in just a minute, we want to be cautious of time, but I think one of the questions I think that are the last maybe kind of things I'd love you guys to speak to is two forms. One is how do we do this well? And then secondly, how do we do this well outside the church? Because those are really two fundamental different things, right? So how can we do this well? Maybe some things you've seen that haven't been done well, but in particular, what are some ways in which we can do this well? And then how can we do this well when we're talking to our friends or neighbors, people that at this point don't hold a Christian faith or hold a different worldview? How can we be people who, and particularly as it speaks out of your personal worldview on creation? So if you guys want to speak to that briefly, that'd be awesome.
I can kick us off maybe, and you guys can, fill in all the things I'm going to miss. But I think for me, it really boils down both in the church and out of the church of we have to take each other's questions seriously. So like part of the reason that I didn't think this mattered was because I didn't actually understand when I was in college the theological implications of the position I was taking. So I do have a lot of questions, right? What do you do about death before the fall? So when God said it was very good, what did he mean, right? Anything except a young earth position has to say that particular types of death happened with the fall, but other types of death were probably happening before then. What do you do with that? We were talking in our discussion earlier, all three of us actually would say that we think having a historical Adam is actually fairly critical. Not everyone's going to agree with that necessarily, but that has big implications potentially for your idea of the atonement, right? And so just the fact that just because somebody's questions are different than yours, like do them the credit of walking through it. So if you're teaching or leading or mentoring, but even if just you're friending people, like how do we actually listen well, and how do we help each other do the work to answer our questions? And how can we show each other grace in the church to be allowed to change our minds when we encounter stuff that's persuasive to us? But outside the church, the same question of we can be scared of talking about science because we think that somewhere in the heart of it, either we don't know enough of it or we're worried that science is going to be like the Achilles heel of Christianity. I think that being able to come with a robust sense that says, hey, there are very faithful people who are Christians, who are scientists. I don't know, but let me look it up and do some reading and get back to you. Or, hey, let's have a conversation about that. Like, if you aren't going to let it break your faith, usually that takes all of the edge and energy out of someone who's just raising it as an objection because they don't know any better. So hang with it. Don't get scared, and just sort of allow them to, if that's the real question and you don't know about it, do some research. If that's not their real question, weathering it will get you to the conversation you really need to have. So be patient.
Yeah, one of the things, just to say, I mean, we talked about this when we were together, but like one of the things that I think is really tragic is to hear the story of young men and women going off to college, and if their only option is to think whether it's just only a young Earth view, that anything else than that is anathema, you know, that it's that anything else is heresy, then they crash into some science teacher or something in college, and then they're like,
Yes.
the whole thing unravels and everything starts falling apart. It's like, whoa, 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 whoa! It doesn't have to fall apart just because of that one thing. Plus, well, there's a there's a scope here we can look at, but this is not the primary thing.
No, I can't emphasize this like enough. Like Christianity and naturalism are enemies, and naturalism should be put to death. Science is a tool that is used by every worldview, and you should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Keep the science, but know the difference between the science and the naturalism. Please, please, please.
Kevin, Clark, any thoughts on the just how do we do this well? Ways in which you've seen it done well, maybe not well, that are helpful for you as you kind of walk through this with Christians and non-Christians.
Yeah, well, I do want to say that I think young Earth creationists are guilty of being obnoxious in a number of ways, and holding that that's the only possible position, and if you don't hold it, you're not orthodox. So I can't reiterate what Ivy said anymore, that we need to be open and listen. And I love Hebrews 11, I think it's verse 3, that says, by faith we believe that God created the universe. So that's the essential thing. How he did it is a tertiary matter. So I think we always have to keep that in mind.
Kevin, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think to your point about the humility, I mean, this is to think that you have the exact right answer when this has been discussed thousands of years, and none of us can really know everything about science and know everything about theology, Bible studies. So Alistair McGrath is someone you may want to read. He has a PhD in biophysics and a PhD in theology, but that's not very many people. It's certainly not any of us. So maybe read some of him. But I think that taking the humility, realizing there's a huge perspective on this, and trying to hold to the core tenet. We talk about this a lot in Preacher Team with the Apostles' Creed. Like, we know that God created the earth, and I think having humility to start there and saying after that it gets a little confusing is an okay thing. And I think it's okay to admit. I've been, people have been surprised when I talk to them. People are non-believers, people you work with, those sort of things. When you're like, I don't know, this is confusing. They don't expect that, and I think we need to be honest about that. And then, kind of like we've done tonight, I think hopefully it's modeling it well. I think that was one of the points of this. So, I think you want to tell them your view and why, and kind of how you came to it, and then maybe a little about other people, in your church.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things, there's been several questions, some good comments too, some other resources some folks have posted, very cool. So what I'm going to do is we'll do a little bit of I'm going to wrap up something real quick here, and then maybe we can jump into a couple of these questions, see if we can kick them around. But one of the things that I think is pivotal, and one of the things you may be asking, especially if you're part of Roswell Community Church, is like, so which one is Roswell Community Church? Which one do we hold? Is it A, B, C? So when someone's going to raise the flag, it's the RCC flag. I have bad news for you. We're not going to raise the flag. At RCC, we believe that God created the earth. That's what we believe. The how, we hold that very loosely. I can't remember if it was Kevin, if it was you or Clark that talked about, if you talk about the denominationalism stuff real quick, about you look across the span. Was that you, Kevin?
Yeah. I looked into like the Southern Baptist Convention, the Presbyterian Church in America, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, the conservative denominations, and they don't take a stance either way. And then if you go to some of the broader ones, like the Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church, they just say evolution's okay.
Gotcha.
But they don't come down really at all.
If you're going to go, the bottom line is this: if you're going to go to an evangelical Protestant denominational, like you're not going to get this is how it happened. Like it's just not, they're not going to declare, which is, I think, some of what we're talking about the humility of this not being a primary matter. And I think that's the one thing as part of our development as humble disciples of Jesus, is that we recognize the difference between primary matters and secondary and tertiary. And if you think about the primary things that they're few, and they really, really matter. They are the difference between orthodoxy and a lack of orthodoxy. So that's like, is Jesus God? If Jesus is not God, or if the resurrection didn't happen, like the game is over. And we're just wasting our time right now talking about this. We should just, eat, drink, and be merry, do whatever we want, because it doesn't matter. So that's orthodoxy. That's primary matters. And unfortunately, what's happened, in the church, that we try to push stuff that's secondary or tertiary into the primary category, and then we get into big fights about stuff that aren't pivotal to the central elements. I think that's one of the things that being a disciple of Jesus, and I think I'll quote Art. I remember him saying this to me. It's like, the older I get, the less things I hold with absolute certainty. And that's what my systematic theology professor said. There are very few things that you should take a bullet for, but those things, like, you should take a bullet for it. So that's the piece where we want to learn to be those kinds of thoughtful and learning how to differentiate primary versus secondary versus tertiary. And some of what we'd advocate in our conversation together, we'd advocate is that the how of creation can remain in even a tertiary matter. And that God created cannot, but how God created can remain a tertiary matter as to where you land. You can remain in the same church with people. Here we are, 3 of us, right? I mean, 4 of us, and there's 3 different views, and we're on the same team. So like, we can remain in the same church, worshiping the same God, wrestling with the scriptures, encouraging each other to love and good deeds, and hold 3 fundamentally different views on creation. So that's what I hope is one of the things that we can learn to do really, really well. And by doing that, by loving each other well, we show the world and anyone who's looking that, like, this is really beautiful, that we can agree or disagree on opinions without having to pull each other apart. Now, for some people, it becomes a secondary matter, and that's where you're like, hey, listen, we're cool, like, we're brothers and sisters, but I'm not sure we're going to be in the same church because we're going to rub a little bit too much. So that'd be a secondary matter, but that's not what we're talking here. We're actually talking primary versus tertiary, and that's some of what we'd invite you to kind of consider and think through as you think about your view of creation. So I just want to say thanks so much for all the conversation and dialogue. A couple questions that emerged, so if you need to punch off, that's totally cool. I'm going to go ahead and just ask a few of these, see if we want to kick them around, because they're kind of fun. Let's just go with the first one. I thought was great. Where do the dinosaurs fit into each of your positions of creation? Come on. We got to have the dinosaur question. Otherwise, we didn't really have a creation conversation. So where do the dinosaurs fit in as you think about your creation? Real quick, what do you got, Clark? Where do the dinosaurs? What happened?
Okay. Of course, I don't really know, but my thought is they were on the ark. Most of them died with the flood, and the atmosphere, I think, changed after the flood, and they didn't adapt to the atmosphere and died out and became extinct. But
so potential post flood. Now, I think there's probably variation. I've heard some young Earth where it's like the flood was actually part of the destruction of dinosaurs. So I know that's kind of the nuance there. So Ivy, what about you?
And that's where you get the dinosaur fossils and stuff.
Right. Ivy, what you got? What you got on dinosaurs?
I'd love that to be true, just because I love the idea of like a T-Rex head like poking out of the ark. I just think that would be great. Like, we've missed out on so many Sunday school illustrations. It would have been fabulous.
It must have been a baby too.
It's no longer the giraffe coming out of the top.
We lost something there. We did. So it kind of depends on where you land. For whether you, my view is probably, even if God, I'm more inclined to say that like there's 6 like literal days separated by a ton of time. But if I'm saying that there's a ton of time between those, naturally I'm saying that there is death involved. I don't find that hugely problematic as long as it's not human death. Like, I think that the fall did something special, because like there are midges that only live for like 48 hours. So did that mean that before the fall they lived forever? Or does it mean that some types of death aren't as significant? Like, Adam and Eve were eating plants, so there was plant death in the garden. Clearly that's not a thing that we're worried about. And so for me, I would put dinosaurs in that same category of maybe they lived for a really long time, they died, their death wasn't innately immoral or bad. That was just part of the creative cycle. I am ambivalent on whether they overlapped with people. I have no clue. I have a lot of questions about that. I don't really understand dinosaur fossils at all. So that's something I'd like to learn more about, because I feel like I know more about the human record. And then we get to dinosaurs and I'm like, I don't even know what bone that is. No idea.
Gotcha. I mean, we know Jurassic Park, but other than that.
I'm great at Jurassic Park. If that's actually science, I'm great with dinosaurs. I have paleontologist friends who tell me that's not true. So.
Oh, man.
I know.
Yeah, what about you? What do you do with dinosaurs?
So I have a memory game, the concentration that's based on Noah's Ark. And, you flip them over and you have to pair the male and the female.
Nice.
And in that, this is what I play with Jules. There's unicorns and dinosaurs and dragons. And what happens is they're matched it and make it. So I think that's the, no, I'm kidding. So for me,
there it goes. Oh.
Yeah, it's like, whoops. So for dinosaurs, yeah, they died, 65 million years ago. Did not overlap with humans. The world's really old. So it's, yeah.
Okay.
Basically it.
Okay. So the old Earth view does raise a question that I haven't found an answer to. Is an old Earth creation point of view? How do you handle death of animals before the fall? So you brought that up briefly. Do you want to speak any more to that?
So different theologians take different perspectives on this, but basically you're going to have to say something along the lines of what the fall did was cause a particular type of death that was specifically awful and broken, and it had repercussions on the whole of creation in unique ways, but it would be more about brokenness in creation than it would be about creating all the death of everything at the fall. So there are a lot of nuances to that, but that's kind of the general idea. A lot of the church fathers were fairly comfortable with that idea as well. So theologically, it's not a new position. Like, people didn't come up with that theology when Darwin wrote Origin of the Species. That's idea has been around for a long time. But you're going to have to decide what you think about sin, what you think about original sin. All that's going to work in there.
Yeah, I know sometimes I think there's been the conversation around if God, when God clothes Adam and Eve, that was the first sacrifice, that was the first death. And so I think there's sometimes I've heard that be put into, elevated to a really high level of a strong theological declaration about that particular act by God on behalf of humanity. I think that's some of where I think some of the challenges have come in with those pieces, but and some nuance to that there's not a lot of clarity. It's obviously not directly declared either.
I think there's
real quick, just like from a miraculous standpoint, a bear going from an herbivore to a carnivore after 6 days isn't more or less likely. And so just kind of this reality of kind of no matter what we say here, we think the fall was massively significant and made humongous repercussions on the planet. I don't think the significance of the fall changes, or kind of the amount of gap we have to fill in not knowing really changes from one to the other. So I think that also kind of helps us come to this being I can't wait to hear the answer to this someday, just because I'm really curious what actually was going on.
Right.
Yeah.
This one is on the evolutionary creationism side, Kevin. How does evolutionary creationism view a separate intentional creation of man that we see in Genesis? Because there's some spectrum there on evolutionary creationism on the historical Adam piece. So you want to kind of just give us some of that spectrum piece?
Yeah. I think there's a few that would maybe not rule out a special creation. I don't think that's the most popular. I think there are some who...
So just say a little bit more about a special creation. So in the evolutionary creation, is that there was a special creation of Adam? Is that what you mean?
Basically, humans are then actually separate from... It's kind of got its foot both in Ivy and or the old Earth and but I've seen it some in that where you had the evolution of all other animals, and then you get close to something, you have other hominids, and then a special creation of Adam and Eve. I think that's a little contrived, honestly, because it's trying to have too many things, I think, because it's a difficult question what to do with Adam and Eve. Others, then kind of on the other side is just a completely allegorical Adam and Eve. That was the view of C.S. Lewis. He didn't think they were historical Adam and Eve. And then kind of within, kind of in between, is just a different way of understanding what historical Adam and Eve would be. For me personally, I look at it as, Genesis 1 is kind of our general framework. The earth was created. Genesis 2, it says God created a garden and brought man in. So it's kind of like a representative head. You know, it's not that different than God deciding to pick Abraham out of a random group of people and make him the father of the nations. In that sense, we're taking a hominid, early Homo sapien, whatever you want to call it, and making that the representative head by then, you know, breathing into life, giving that the soul, giving it the moral identity, giving it the image of God. And so it's kind of, I mean, it's the most difficult question for sure. And there's a lot of solutions. I'm not entirely sure where I stand on it. I do believe in historical Adam and Eve. I don't think it's allegorical. I don't think it's just purely representative or metaphorical. I do think there was an Adam and an Eve that interacted with God in a specific location and time and place. So.
Okay, cool. So again, a lot of nuance, right? A lot of humility there. Okay, I think that covers pretty much most of the questions that have emerged. I appreciate y'all who have been on the call. Kevin and Ivy and Clark, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Hopefully, this is the beginning of certain thoughts for y'all. We're going to be posting some resources on the RCC Connect page, Facebook Connect page. I do want to say this is maybe the single thing I'll just, if you're like, hey, I just want to get a better sense of what all these things can look like. This is maybe a worthwhile recommendation. This is basically a 4 views book: creation, evolution, and intelligent design, and it really gives you a sense of the 4 different views. And it's called literally 4 views on creation, evolution, and intelligent design, and it's put out by Zondervan. It has 4 different contributors. One in particular that's worthy of note, particularly if you're going to be having conversations with people who are maybe not Christians, is the conversation around intelligent design, which, since you have the 3 views that we just heard today or tonight in our conversation, but then there's really kind of a 4th conversation, which really encompasses all of these, that talks about intelligent design, and that's a worthwhile understanding. Stephen Myers is kind of the front runner on this, and a brilliant dude, very articulate. You can find we have some great videos for you to watch on YouTube, and that we'll be posting on the resource side. But that's kind of like he's not taking a position. They don't take a position in a sense with any of this. They would just say, it's impossible to look at science and not say there's someone behind this. There's a someone, not just something, but a someone, an intelligent designer. And if there's an intelligent designer and we want to call him God, then from there we can start building towards the opportunity for faith in a God who would then move and redeem and change the world through his son. So that's really the picture of what that can move towards. So a really good resource. The way it's written is very simple. One person gives their perspective, and the other 3 kind of take shots at them. So it's a little bit more of a debate in that sense, but it's sometimes a little heady. Sometimes it's very instructive. So worth picking up if this is something you'd like to understand more about, read more, learn more. But love more is what we want to see out of who we are in Christ, right? So let's be people who love well, who have conversations like this that are fantastic, that open us up to what God may have. And so thank you, the 3 of you. I love you all. Thank you for being a part of this. Those of you who are here tonight, grateful to have you a part of this conversation. If you have more thoughts, definitely jump on the Facebook page. I'm sure we'll be posting some things that you can interact with. Have a great week. Hope you're enjoying the scriptures and stepping into the rest of Genesis as we move towards the end of our first book of the Bible in the next week and next few days. So have a great night. Thanks so much, guys.
Bye.